The hearing room held 200 people, and the kind of silence that only arrives when everyone present understands that something is about to be decided that cannot be undecided. Dr. Nora Vasquez stood at the center of it, her notes face down on the table in front of her, her hands folded on top of them. Across the room, behind the long, curved dais of the State Medical Ethics Board, Dr. Edmund Hale watched her with the particular expression of a man who has spent 30 years believing that rooms like this one exist to protect people like him. He had not yet understood what she had brought with her today. She had been carrying it for 11 years, 11 hours earlier. The first thing Nora did every morning before anything else was read the case file she wasn't supposed to have. Not because she was reckless, because she had learned 11 years ago, in a conference room that smelled like cold coffee and ambition, that the only way to survive what was coming was to understand it more completely than the people trying to bury it. The file sat in a manila envelope inside a fireproof lockbox, inside the closet of her home office in Millhaven, a mid-sized city in central Ohio, where the Forensic Pathology Division of the County Medical Examiner's Office occupied the basement of a building that had last been renovated during the first Bush administration. Nora had worked there for 7 years. She had been passed over for department head twice. The second time, the man who got the position instead of her had fewer publications, less field experience, and a name that appeared in the acknowledgement section of Edmund Hale's landmark 2004 textbook on forensic methodology. She noticed things like that. She had always noticed things like that. That Tuesday morning in late October, she made coffee, retrieved the file, sat down at the kitchen table, and did not open it yet. She looked at it the way she had looked at it dozens of times over the years. The envelope had been resealed so many times, the flap no longer held without tape. Inside it, photocopies of 3 internal memos, a draft methodology paper with her handwriting in the margins, 2 email chains printed on paper that had yellowed slightly at the edges, and a USB drive containing the original data files from the Callaway study. The study that had made Edmund Hale a nationally recognized name in forensic biomarker analysis and had made Nora Vasquez, who had designed its methodology, a person whose name appeared nowhere in its published form. She poured her coffee. She added no sugar. She opened the file. The hearing was in 11 hours. She had been preparing for it, in one form or another, for 11 years. The call to testify had not come from Nora. She needed to be clear about that, at least to herself, because the version of events that Hale's legal team had already begun circulating, quietly, through channels that left no written record, was that she had manufactured this opportunity, that she had spent a decade nursing a grudge and had finally found a procedural avenue to act on it. What had actually happened was simpler and stranger and much harder to dismiss. A second-year resident named Gabriel Torres at the University of Millhaven Medical Center had been working on a follow-up study to the Callaway research. He was not trying to uncover fraud. He was trying to extend the findings, except when he went back to the original published data to cross-reference his baseline numbers, something didn't fit. The statistical distribution in Table 4 of Hale's 2006 paper was internally inconsistent in a way that was nearly invisible unless you happened to be working with the same underlying variables from a different direction. Gabriel had brought it to his department supervisor, who had brought it to the university's Research Integrity Office, which had done what research integrity offices do when the name on the paper in question belongs to someone who has an endowed chair and a building named after him. It had moved very, very slowly for 8 months before a junior investigator named Patricia Mohn had requested an independent forensic review of the original data. That request had landed, by the kind of institutional accident that looks like fate and is actually just bureaucratic geography, on Nora's desk. She had read Patricia Mohn's preliminary findings on a Wednesday afternoon in February. She had sat very still in her office for approximately 4 minutes. Then she had picked up the phone and called the one person she trusted to tell her whether what she was seeing was real. "It's real," said Dr. Cass Okafor, who had been her closest friend since their residency, and who now ran a biostatistics consulting practice in Columbus. Cass had reviewed the data files Nora sent over that evening. She called back at 11 o'clock at night, which told Nora everything she needed to know about the severity of what Cass had found. The numbers in the published paper don't match the original data set. Someone cleaned the data after the analysis was run, selectively, in a way that would have required knowing exactly which outliers were weakening the central finding. Nora had asked the question she already knew the answer to. Who had access to the original dataset at the time of publication? A pause. According to the file headers, 2 people, Hale, and someone listed as primary data analyst, listed as NV, Nora Vasquez, whose name appeared nowhere in the published paper, who had been listed in an internal university document that she had discovered 3 years after the fact and added to her manila envelope as research assistant, undergraduate, for the duration of the Callaway study. A study she had entered as a 4th-year doctoral candidate with a completed dissertation chapter on the exact methodology the study employed. She had been 28 years old. She had believed, with the particular faith of someone who has been told all their life that systems work when you work within them, that the right person would notice eventually. Nobody had noticed. Or rather, the people who might have noticed had calculated, consciously or not, that noticing was less useful to them than not noticing. Cass had said, at the end of that phone call, "You know what this means." "Yes," Nora had said. "Are you ready for it?" Nora had looked at the manila envelope sitting on her kitchen table, at 11 years of careful, methodical, unhurried documentation, at the USB drive that contained the original data files she had kept a copy of, not because she had anticipated needing them, but because she kept copies of everything she worked on as a matter of professional practice, a habit so embedded she hadn't even thought of it as protection at the time. "I've been ready," she said, "for longer than I realized." The Medical Ethics Board hearing was scheduled for 9 a.m. in the Hargrove building on the university's main campus. By 7:30, Nora had dressed, reviewed her notes for the last time, and was standing in her kitchen drinking a second cup of coffee she didn't need when her phone rang. The number was unfamiliar. She answered anyway. "Dr. Vasquez." The voice was male, careful, the tone of someone who practices sounding reasonable. "My name is Andrew Price. I'm calling on behalf of Dr. Hale's legal representation." Nora set her coffee down. She did not say anything. "I'm sure you understand," Price continued, "that what you're walking into this morning is going to be extraordinarily difficult for everyone involved. Dr. Hale has made significant contributions to this field. His work has shaped forensic methodology nationally. A proceeding of this nature, however it resolves, will cause damage that can't be undone." Nora picked up a pen. She wrote down his name, the time, and the word called on the notepad she kept by the phone for exactly this kind of thing. "I think what I'm hearing," she said, "is that you'd like me to reconsider testifying." A pause. "I think what I'd like is for you to consider the full picture." "The full picture," Nora said, "is what I intend to present to the board this morning. Thank you for calling, Mr. Price." She hung up. She added a second note below his name. Nervous. If they were calling her at 7:30 in the morning, they had already calculated that the evidence she was bringing was sufficient to damage them. The call wasn't a threat. It was reconnaissance. They were trying to determine, by her response, how much she actually had. She picked up her bag. She picked up the file. She walked out of her house into an October morning that was cold and clear and precise, and she drove to the Hargrove building without the radio on, because she needed the quiet. She had driven this route before, 7 years ago, when she'd first applied for the department head position and been told, gently, by a man whose gentleness had the consistency of a closed door, that the committee felt the role required someone with a stronger research publication record. She had not said anything in that meeting. She had thanked him, driven home, and added the conversation to the envelope. There were many things she had not said over 11 years. They were all going to be said today. The parking structure nearest the Hargrove building was full by 8:15, which told Nora the hearing had attracted more attention than the university had expected or wanted. She found a space 3 blocks away and walked, her coat buttoned against the wind, her bag over her shoulder, moving at the pace of someone who is not in a hurry because they arrived exactly when they planned to. In the lobby, she recognized 2 faces from the university's forensic science department. Junior faculty who gave her small, carefully neutral nods that meant they knew why she was there and had not yet decided what to think about it. She nodded back. She did not stop. The hearing room was on the 4th floor. Outside it, in the corridor, a cluster of people had gathered. Some she identified as reporters, some as university administrators, 2 as attorneys she recognized from Hale's legal team by the quality of their suits and the way they tracked her entrance across the corridor with the quiet attention of people who have prepared for a specific variable and are now watching it arrive. She did not acknowledge them. She found a seat at the witness table, set her bag down, and placed her notes face down in front of her. Then she waited. Edmund Hale arrived at 8:55, which was deliberately, almost performatively, 5 minutes early. He was 61 years old, silver-haired, broad-shouldered, in a way that still carried authority, even now that the authority was under question. He had the kind of face that appeared well on book jackets and conference programs. Open, considered, the face of a man who has been believed for a very long time and has internalized that belief as his natural state. He saw her the moment he entered. She saw him see her. He did not approach. He took his seat on the opposite side of the room, leaned toward his lead attorney, and said something brief. The attorney made a note. Nora looked down at her papers. She turned one over, read a single line, turned it back, face down. At 9 o'clock exactly, the chair of the State Medical Ethics Board, a precise woman in her 50s named Dr. Sylvia Crane, called the room to order. Here we go, Nora thought, and felt nothing she hadn't already prepared for. The hearing opened with procedural groundwork, the formal reading of the complaint, the scope of the board's jurisdiction, the rights of both the respondent and the witnesses. Dr. Crane ran it efficiently and without warmth, the manner of someone who had conducted enough of these to know that efficiency was its own form of respect. Nora sat through it with her hands folded in her lap. On her left sat Patricia Mohn, the junior research integrity investigator who had first formally flagged the discrepancy. A woman in her early 30s who held herself with the careful stillness of someone who understood that being right and being safe are not always the same thing, and had chosen to be right anyway. On Nora's right was the empty chair that represented the board's invitation to Cass Okafor, who had submitted her statistical analysis in writing rather than appearing in person, for reasons that had nothing to do with the strength of her findings and everything to do with a non-disclosure agreement with a university research partner that her attorney had advised made her physical presence inadvisable. The absence of Cass's chair was the first thing Hale's lead attorney, a man named Gerald Forsyth, raised when the floor opened to initial statements. The board should note, Forsyth said, standing with the kind of unhurried confidence that expensive representation buys, that the statistical analysis central to the complaint against Dr. Hale has been submitted exclusively in written form. Dr. Okafor, whose methodology underlies much of what we're being asked to evaluate this morning, is not present and therefore cannot be cross-examined. The board should weigh this absence accordingly. Dr. Crane looked at him with an expression that suggested she had already considered and evaluated this point before he finished the sentence. The board notes the submission format and will evaluate Dr. Okafor's analysis on its methodological merits, as is standard procedure for written expert testimony. Counsel may address any specific methodological concerns through the witnesses who are present. Ms. Mohn, you may begin. Patricia Mohn's opening statement was 12 minutes long. She was not a natural public speaker. Her voice carried the slight over-precision of someone who has rehearsed to compensate for nerves. But the substance was devastating in its plainness. She walked the board through the sequence of events exactly as they had occurred. Gabriel Torres's anomaly, the research integrity investigation, the data request, the comparison between the original data set and the published figures. She put 3 slides on the screen behind her. The first showed Table 4 from Hale's 2006 paper, the table Gabriel Torres had flagged. The second showed the corresponding data distribution from the original files on Nora's USB drive. The third showed them side by side. The room went quiet in a specific way. Not the polite quiet of people listening to a presentation, but the particular silence of people who have just seen something that cannot be unseen. 2 of the 5 board members leaned forward simultaneously. A reporter in the back row stopped typing. The discrepancy, Patricia said, affects 37 data points across 2 variables. In each case, the direction of adjustment is consistent. The outliers that were removed were the ones that would have weakened the paper's central finding. The adjustments were not documented in any version of the methodology that has been produced during this investigation. Forsyth rose. I'd like to note for the board that the original dataset referenced in this presentation has a single documented chain of custody, running through a personal external drive maintained by Dr. Vasquez, who is the primary data analyst listed in the original file headers, Dr. Crane said, without looking up from her notes. Yes, counsel. The board is aware. You will have the opportunity to address chain of custody during cross-examination. Please allow Ms. Mohn to complete her statement. Forsyth sat. His left hand, resting on the table, tightened very slightly. Nora clocked it. Hale's opening statement was given by Forsyth on his behalf, which was itself a kind of information. Men who believe they can command a room give their own opening statements. Forsyth's argument was careful and structural. He did not deny that discrepancies existed between the original data and the published paper. He argued instead that data cleaning and selection are standard components of the analytical process, that decisions about which data points to include or exclude are matters of scientific judgment rather than misconduct, and that the complaint against Dr. Hale amounted to a retrospective challenge to legitimate methodological choices dressed up in the language of fraud. The central question before this board, Forsyth said, is not whether Dr. Hale made the same choices a different analyst might have made. The question is whether there is evidence of deliberate intent to deceive. And the complaint, however thorough its documentation, does not provide that evidence. It provides a disagreement. And scientific disagreement, however heated, is not misconduct. It was a competent argument. Nora had expected it. She had been preparing her answer to it for approximately 7 years, which was how long ago she had understood what form the defense would take if this day ever arrived. She was called to the stand at 10:45. Dr. Crane looked at her steadily. Dr. Vasquez, you've been listed as the primary data analyst for the original Callaway study dataset. Can you describe your role in that research? Nora's voice, when she answered, was the voice she used in court testimony. Level, precise, stripped of the personal investment that would have been more honest and less useful. I was a fourth-year doctoral candidate at the time the Callaway study was initiated. I was brought onto the project by Dr. Hale following a colloquium presentation I gave on biomarker distribution methodology in forensic analysis. My role was to design the analytical framework, execute the data collection protocol, and perform the primary statistical analysis. I completed all three of those functions over approximately 14 months. And your contribution was documented how? Internally, I was listed as primary data analyst in the original project files. I was told by Dr. Hale on 3 separate occasions that I documented in writing that I would be listed as second author on the published paper. Nora paused. Just one beat. The paper was published in the Journal of Forensic Science in March 2006. My name does not appear in it. A small sound moved through the room, not audible enough to be called a murmur, but present. No acknowledgement? No acknowledgement. No footnote. The methodology section describes the analytical approach I designed using the passive voice. Data was collected and analyzed using a modified biomarker distribution framework. No attribution. No citation of my dissertation chapter, which contained the foundational description of that framework, and which Dr. Hale had read in its entirety before initiating the study. Dr. Crane made a note. Did you raise this with Dr. Hale at the time? I raised it 3 times. The first time, he told me the journal had strict authorship criteria and that given my student status, the editors had advised limiting the byline. I later confirmed that no such communication from the journal exists in the editorial record. The second time, he told me that my contribution would be properly credited in the follow-up research he was planning. That research was published 4 years later. I am not credited in it either. The third time, I raised it in a formal written communication to Dr. Hale and copied the department chair. What happened? I was informed 3 weeks later that my funding allocation for the following academic year had been administratively reassigned. Nora said it flatly. I completed my doctorate the following spring on a reduced funding package. I have not held an academic research position since. The silence in the room had changed texture. It was heavier now. Forsyth rose. Dr. Vasquez, isn't it true that your formal complaint at the time was reviewed by the department chair and found to be insufficiently documented? Nora said. Yes, I'm aware of what the review concluded. I'm also aware that the department chair at the time was listed in the acknowledgments of Dr. Hale's 2004 textbook as a valued colleague and intellectual companion. I documented that as well. A beat. I document everything, she said. I always have. Forsyth looked at her with an expression she had seen before on the faces of people who have underestimated a specific opponent for so long that the recalibration comes as genuine surprise. He sat down without completing his question. The board member at the far left of the dais, a forensic statistician named Dr. James Alton, who had been quiet through the entire morning, looked up from his notes for the first time and said, Dr. Vasquez, you mentioned a USB drive containing the original dataset. Can you walk the board through the documentation of that drive's chain of custody since the study concluded? Yes, Nora said. I can. She reached into her bag and produced a folder. It was 4 inches thick. The folder contained 11 years of documentation. Not all of it. She had left the redundant material at home, the duplicates and the older drafts of notes that said the same thing as the cleaner versions. What she had brought was the essential structure, a chain of custody log for the USB drive dated from March 2006 through the previous week, with entries countersigned at every significant interval by a notary or a credible third party. The drive had never left her possession except for 2 periods. Once in 2019, when she had submitted it to a licensed digital forensics firm in Columbus for an authenticated bit-for-bit copy, and once 2 months ago when she had submitted that authenticated copy to the Research Integrity Office as part of Patricia Mohn's investigation. Both transfers were documented. Both returns were documented. The digital forensics report, confirming the integrity and original creation dates of the files, was included. Dr. Alton reviewed the chain of custody log for approximately 4 minutes without speaking. The hearing room had gone to the particular stillness of people who have stopped thinking about what they're going to do next and started simply watching. The creation timestamps on these files, Dr. Alton said finally, predate the published paper by how long? The raw data files were created between February 2004 and November 2005, Nora said. The paper was submitted for publication in August 2005 and published in March 2006. The analytical outputs, the files containing the full unmodified dataset, were created in November 2005, approximately 9 months before publication. And the divergence between those files and the published Table 4, when would that divergence have been introduced? Based on the version history of the published submission, which the journal provided to the Research Integrity Office as part of its cooperation with this investigation, Nora produced a second document, passed it to the clerk, who relayed it to the board. The final version of the manuscript was submitted in January 2006. Between November 2005 and January 2006, Table 4 changed. The underlying data in my original files did not. Dr. Alton sat back. He exchanged a look with the board member to his right, a brief, compressed look of the kind that contains an entire conversation. Forsyth rose. Your Honor, Dr. Crane, I'd like to note that the journal submission timeline Dr. Vasquez has just described was provided by the journal's editorial office voluntarily and is not part of the formal evidentiary record as submitted. It is now, Dr. Crane said. Clerk, please mark Dr. Vasquez's exhibit as Board Exhibit 7 and enter it into the record. Counsel, you may address the timeline documentation during your cross-examination period. Dr. Vasquez, please continue. Forsyth sat. The attorney next to him, younger, whose name Nora had not been given, wrote something on a notepad and slid it toward him. He read it. His jaw tightened. Nervous, Nora thought. The same word she had written on her kitchen notepad that morning. She had rehearsed the next section of her testimony more than any other, because it was the one most likely to be framed, by Forsyth and by Hale's supporters in the room, as personal grievance dressed as evidence. She had to walk the line between precision and detachment so cleanly that there was no purchase left for that framing to take hold. Dr. Vasquez, Dr. Crane said, you mentioned earlier that you documented 3 conversations with Dr. Hale regarding your expected authorship credit. Do those documents form part of what you've submitted today? Yes. Nora produced 3 printed email chains, each clipped separately. The first is a 2005 email exchange in which Dr. Hale confirms, in writing, that he and I had a conversation about authorship. He does not in this email deny that the conversation occurred. He describes it as a discussion of publication logistics. The second is a 2006 email following the paper's publication in which I raised the omission directly. His response consists of 2 sentences. The third is my formal written communication to him in 2007, and his reply, which I would characterize as, she paused, non-responsive to the specific question asked. The board member at the center of the dais, a physician named Dr. Maria Costa, who had the expression of someone who has been a woman in a professional setting long enough to recognize a particular species of institutional maneuvering, said, What did his reply say? Nora looked at the page. I'm confident that our collaborative relationship has benefited your professional development in ways that are not always visible in formal attribution. The room was very quiet. Dr. Costa's expression did not change, but she wrote something on her notepad and underlined it twice. Forsyth's cross-examination lasted 40 minutes. It was exhaustive, technically proficient, and built around two central arguments: that the data cleaning Nora described as fraudulent was within the range of normal analytical discretion, and that her documentation, however thorough, reflected the perspective of a single interested party who had, his language was careful, a documented history of professional dissatisfaction with Dr. Hale's decisions. Nora answered every question in the same register she had used for 3 hours. Level, specific, refusing to be goaded into anything that resembled the emotional response the framing was designed to elicit. You would agree, Forsyth said, that the decision to exclude outliers from a statistical analysis is a judgment call that reasonable scientists may make differently? In general, yes. And you would agree that Dr. Hale, as the named principal investigator on the Callaway study, had ultimate scientific authority over the published methodology? He had institutional authority, yes. Then isn't it possible that what you're calling data manipulation was simply Dr. Hale exercising his scientific judgment in a way you disagreed with? Nora looked at him. She let a beat pass. Not long enough to be theatrical, just long enough to be deliberate. If Dr. Hale had exercised his judgment before the analysis was run, she said, by pre-registering the exclusion criteria in the study protocol, which was not done, or by documenting the exclusion decisions in the methods section of the paper, which was not done, or by flagging the excluded data points in a supplementary table, which was not done, then yes, that would be scientific judgment. What happened instead was that 37 data points disappeared between the final analytical output and the published manuscript, with no documentation, no methodology disclosure, and no trace in any version of the record except the original files. That is not judgment. That is concealment. Forsyth moved on. He spent the next 12 minutes trying to establish that Nora's maintenance of the original data files over 11 years was itself evidence of a premeditated effort to build a case rather than an act of professional record-keeping. You kept these files for over a decade, he said. Through multiple jobs, multiple moves, you had them authenticated in 2019, 3 years before this investigation was initiated. That's an unusual level of foresight for someone who claims they weren't planning to use them. Nora had prepared for this one specifically. I keep copies of all primary data I generate as a matter of professional practice, she said. I have copies of data from every study I've contributed to since my 2nd year of graduate school. I can provide the board with a complete inventory if that would be helpful. She paused. The reason I had these particular files authenticated in 2019 is that a paper was published that year by a former colleague of Dr. Hale's, using a methodology that appeared to build directly on the unpublished elements of my doctoral dissertation. I began the authentication process at that time as a precaution. The precaution turned out to be warranted. She produced one more document, a copy of the 2019 paper, her dissertation chapter. A comparison table she had prepared herself, showing methodological language that was, in her own annotation, not identical and not coincidental. The clerk carried it to the board. Dr. Alton received it, scanned it, and said nothing. But he set it down in the specific way that people set things down when they intend to return to them. The break came at 12:15. The board recessed for 40 minutes. Nora walked to the end of the 4th-floor corridor. found a window that looked out over the campus's central quad. Brown leaves, a few students crossing the grass, a maintenance worker pushing a cart, and stood there with a cup of water she'd gotten from the machine near the elevator. Patricia Mohn appeared beside her. She didn't say anything for a moment. "How are you doing?" she finally asked. "Fine." Nora looked at the quad. A gust of wind sent a small spiral of leaves across the path. "Forsyth is better than I expected. He's going to try something in the afternoon session that he hasn't tried yet." "What makes you think that?" "Because he spent the morning defending the indefensible, and he knows it. He's going to shift tactics. Probably try to establish that the research integrity investigation itself was procedurally compromised, that the board shouldn't be making a determination based on a process that had access to material from a personally interested party before it was formally submitted." She took a drink of water. "It won't work, but it'll cost us time." Patricia studied her. "You've thought about this a lot." "I've had 11 years, Nora said simply. Down the corridor, through the glass panel of the hearing room door, she could see Edmund Hale at the respondents' table in conversation with Forsyth. At one point during the morning session, when the submission timeline exhibit was entered into the record, Hale had done something she hadn't expected. He had looked at her, not with anger, with something that was harder to read. A kind of recalibration. The expression of a man encountering a version of a situation he thought he understood, and discovering it is larger than he calculated. She had looked back. She had not looked away first. "The attorney who called me this morning," Nora said. "His name was Andrew Price. Write that down. I don't know what role he's playing, but he's not on the court filings, which means he's there in some capacity they don't want documented." Patricia wrote it down without asking why. Good, Nora thought. She learns fast. She finished her water and turned back toward the hearing room, and that was when she saw, standing near the elevator, a man she hadn't expected. She stopped walking. He was perhaps 70, slight, in a dark coat, holding a briefcase with both hands. He was looking at her with the specific expression of someone who has been working up the nerve to approach for longer than they expected. She knew who he was. She had never met him, but she knew his name from the Callaway Studies' original project files, where he appeared in a single notation as External Methodology Reviewer, February 2004. His name was Dr. Harold Bassett. He had retired from academic medicine 6 years ago. According to Nora's research, and she had researched everyone connected to the Callaway study, he now lived in Dayton and had not published since 2018. He walked toward her. "Dr. Vasquez," he said, "I don't expect you to recognize me. I reviewed your methodology design for the Callaway study in early 2004. I submitted a written assessment to Dr. Hale rating it as," he paused, "exceptionally rigorous, representing a significant advance over existing approaches in the field." Nora said nothing. She waited. "That assessment," Bassett said quietly, "was never shared with you. I know that because I asked, 6 months after the paper was published, whether you'd been listed as an author. I was told you had been a student assistant." He paused again. His hands on the briefcase were tight. "I would like to testify this afternoon if the board will permit it. I should have said something 11 years ago. I'm saying it now." The corridor was quiet, except for the distant sound of the elevator arriving at another floor. Nora studied him for a long moment. She thought about 11 years. She thought about the manila envelope. She thought about everything she had documented and preserved and carried alone because there had been no one else to carry it. "Talk to the board's clerk," she said. "Ask them to inform Dr. Crane that a material witness has come forward during the recess. They'll make the call on whether to allow the testimony." She walked past him back toward the hearing room. Behind her, she heard the sound of his footsteps turning toward the clerk's office. She did not allow herself to feel what that sound meant. Not yet. Not yet. Wait until it's over. Then feel it. The afternoon session opened with exactly the procedural challenge Nora had predicted. Forsyth rose before Dr. Crane had fully settled into her chair. The defense would like to raise a preliminary matter before we proceed. The board has been asked to evaluate findings from a research integrity investigation that, as the record reflects, was initiated following a referral that included material provided by Dr. Vasquez, a named witness in this proceeding. The defense contends that the commingling of her role as evidence contributor and witness compromises the integrity of the investigation itself, and that the board should therefore require a higher evidentiary standard before drawing conclusions from the investigation's outputs. Dr. Crane looked at him. The look was not unfriendly. It was simply the look of someone who has heard this argument before. Counsel, the research integrity process is not this board's process. We're not evaluating the investigation. We're evaluating the evidence. The provenance of that evidence has been documented in full and will be weighed accordingly. If you have a specific objection to specific exhibits, you may raise those objections in turn. Are you prepared to proceed? Forsyth sat. The attorney beside him wrote nothing this time. The board will now consider a request from a material witness who came forward during the recess. Dr. Crane continued, "The board has reviewed Dr. Harold Bassett's credentials and the nature of his proposed testimony, and has determined that his appearance is relevant to the matter under review. Dr. Bassett, please approach." The room processed this in a specific way. Among the reporters, two leaned forward at the same time. Among Hale's legal team, a look was exchanged that Nora catalogued and filed away. Hale himself, and this was the thing she watched for, the thing she had been watching for all morning, went very still at the respondents' table. Not the stillness of composure, the stillness of a man absorbing a surprise he cannot immediately calculate his way around. Bassett settled into the witness chair with the careful movements of someone his age navigating institutional furniture. He stated his name, his credentials, his connection to the Calloway study. Then he said, in a voice that held the particular steadiness of someone who has been deciding to do something for a long time, "In February 2004, I was retained by Dr. Hale to provide an independent assessment of the analytical methodology for the Calloway study. I reviewed a design document prepared by the project's primary analyst. The document was sophisticated, well-constructed, and methodologically original. I submitted a written assessment to Dr. Hale describing it in those terms." "Was that assessment shared with the study team?" Dr. Crane asked. "No. I confirmed this in 2006 after the study published. I asked Dr. Hale whether the primary analyst, who I now understand to be Dr. Vasquez, had been credited in the publication. I was told she had been listed as a student assistant, and that her role had been supportive rather than primary." Bassett paused. "That description was inconsistent with the material I had reviewed. The methodology I assessed was not the work of a student assistant. It was the intellectual architecture of the entire study. Did you take any action at that time?" "No." The word landed quietly. "I convinced myself it was not my place to intervene in another researcher's publication decisions. I have had 11 years to reconsider that choice." Dr. Alton leaned forward. "Dr. Bassett, do you still have a copy of your assessment from 2004? Bassett reached into his briefcase and produced a document in a plastic sleeve. "I keep copies of every professional assessment I've ever written," he said. Nora had once said almost exactly those same words. She heard the echo of them now, and felt, for the first time since the hearing began, something she hadn't planned for. a loosening in her chest. Something that had been clenched for so long she had forgotten it was clenched. The document was passed to the clerk. The clerk copied it and distributed it to the board. Nora watched Dr. Crane read it, watched the forensic statistician read it, watched Dr. Costa read it, and then set it down on the table and look at a point somewhere above Forsyth's head with the expression of someone doing quiet arithmetic. Forsyth's cross-examination of Bessette lasted 14 minutes. It was the weakest cross of the day. It had nothing to work with. Bessette was retired, had no professional interest in the outcome, and had documentation. The best Forsyth could do was raise the age of the document and the reliability of memory. And Bessette answered both with the calm of a man who has no stake in being liked and no fear of being doubted. "I don't ask the board to take my word for anything," Bessette said at one point. "I brought the document. The document says what I said it says. You can read it." Hale did not testify until mid-afternoon. He had the right to decline. The board had made that clear in the procedural opening. But his legal team, recalculating after Bessette, had decided that his silence would be more damaging than his testimony. He took the stand with the bearing of a man who has spent 60 years walking into rooms expecting them to rearrange themselves around him. It was a practiced bearing. Nora could see the effort behind it now in a way she hadn't when she was 28. Dr. Crane questioned him directly. "Dr. Hale, the board has heard testimony regarding your communication with Dr. Vasquez about authorship credit on the 2006 Callaway paper. Did you tell Dr. Vasquez she would be listed as second author?" "I told her," Hale said carefully, "that I would advocate for her inclusion in the byline. The final publication decision rested with the journal's editors, and the journal's editorial records, which have been submitted to this board, indicate no such communication from the journal advising against her inclusion." A pause. Editorial communications are not always formally documented. The methodology attribution in the published paper. The phrase, "a modified biomarker distribution framework." Was that framework developed by Dr. Vasquez? Another pause, slightly longer. The framework built on existing approaches in the field, including her dissertation chapter. The chapter addressed related questions. "Dr. Hale." Dr. Crane set down her pen. The room noticed. "Dr. Bessette's 2004 assessment, which we've entered into the record today, describes the methodology design he reviewed as, and I'm reading directly, an original analytical contribution that advances beyond existing approaches in meaningful and documentable ways." That review was of Dr. Vasquez's design document. Did you read Dr. Bessette's assessment at the time? A very long pause. "Yes," Hale said. The word was barely audible in the front rows. In the back rows, where the reporters were sitting, it was apparently audible enough. The sound of typing resumed. "And you chose not to share it with Dr. Vasquez." "I made decisions about the research environment that I believed were appropriate at the time." Dr. Crane picked her pen back up, made a note, said nothing more for a moment. Then she said, "Dr. Vasquez, do you have any follow-up questions for Dr. Hale?" Nora had not been expecting the direct invitation. She looked at Dr. Crane, who looked back with an expression that was professionally neutral, and yet contained, she thought, something that recognized what this question cost to ask, and what it might cost to answer. She looked at Hale. He was looking at her, not with the practiced authority of the morning, with something diminished. The look of a man who has run, very publicly, out of the thing he had always relied on. She had written, in her notes the night before, a list of questions she might ask if given this opportunity. She had reviewed them this morning. She had decided, somewhere on the drive to the Hargrove building, that she was not going to use them. She had not come here to take something from him. She had come here to establish what was true. Those were not the same thing, and keeping them separate had been the work of 11 years. "No," she said. "The record speaks for itself." Forsyth's closing argument was professional and diminished. He returned to the scientific judgment framework: outlier exclusion, methodological discretion, the high bar for misconduct versus disagreement. But the energy behind it had shifted. He knew, and the room knew, and Hale, sitting at the defense table, knew that the weight of the day had moved irreversibly. He did not address Bassett's testimony directly. He couldn't. There was nothing to say about a retired professor's 30-year-old document that would make it less than what it was. The board's presenting officer gave a brief summary of the evidentiary record for the formal transcript. Nora sat through it with her hands folded, the way she had sat through the entire morning. Then Dr. Crane looked at her and said, "Dr. Vasquez, you may make a closing statement if you wish. You are not obligated to do so." Nora stood. She had not prepared a closing statement. She had not planned to make one. But standing in that room, with the documentation laid out across 4 hours of testimony, with Harold Bassett sitting 3 chairs to her left, having finally said the thing he should have said 11 years ago, she understood that there was one thing left to say, and that she was the only person in the room who could say it. "I want to be clear about what I'm asking this board to do," she said. "I'm not asking you to punish Dr. Hale because his decisions damaged my career. I'm asking you to make a finding about what actually happened, to the data, to the methodology, to the attribution process, so that the people who came after me, the students and junior researchers who are right now working in environments where this kind of decision gets made, know that it is visible, that it leaves a record, that someone, eventually, will follow that record to where it leads." She paused. "I kept copies of everything," she said. "I always keep copies of everything. That's not strategy. That's just what you do when you've learned that the truth doesn't defend itself. Someone has to carry it. I carried it for 11 years, and I'm setting it down now, right here, in this record." She looked at the board, at Dr. Crane, at Dr. Alton, at Dr. Costa, at each of them in turn. "The rest is yours." She sat down. The room was very quiet. Then Dr. Crane said, "This board will deliberate and issue findings within 15 business days. This hearing is adjourned." The gavel came down, and in the 3 seconds before the room began to move again, Nora Vasquez sat completely still at the witness table with her hands flat on the surface in front of her, and let herself feel, for the first time in 11 years, the specific weight of something she had been holding finally leave her hands. The board's findings arrived on a Thursday morning, 12 days after the hearing. Nora was in the basement of the county medical examiner's office, reviewing autopsy photographs for a wrongful death case, when her phone buzzed with a message from Patricia Mohn. "Results posted. Call me when you can. She finished the photograph she was examining, a discipline she had learned early, that you do not put down the work in the middle of the work no matter what is waiting outside it. And then she set the folder down and called. "They found against him on all 3 counts," Patricia said. Her voice was controlled in the way voices are when someone is trying not to let how much something means to them show. "Fraudulent data manipulation, improper attribution, and, this is the one I didn't expect, failure of mentorship responsibility under the Graduate Research Conduct Code. That last one's going to affect his doctoral program status." Nora sat down in the chair at her desk. "Sanctions? Mandatory retraction of the 2006 paper and the 2010 follow-up. A 2-year prohibition on serving as primary investigator on any federally funded research. and a formal referral to the University Board of Trustees for employment review. The employment review was the one that would matter most, practically speaking. It would take months. It might not result in termination. These things rarely did at the level Hale occupied, but it would be in his permanent institutional record. The paper bearing his name in the Journal of Forensic Science would carry a retraction notice. Every graduate student who had ever cited it would need to recheck their work. The structure he had built on top of her methodology, without her name, would have to be rebuilt from its documentation forward. And the documentation, now entirely part of a public record, made clear where that methodology had come from. "There's one more thing," Patricia said. "The board issued a supplementary note. It's not standard. They almost never do this. It's addressed to the university administration, and it specifically mentions the 2007 complaint you filed and the response you received. The note says, and I'm reading directly, the board finds that institutional response to the 2007 formal complaint represents a systemic failure that this board is referring to the university's general counsel for separate review. They're going after the department chair, too, or whoever made the call to reassign your funding." Nora looked at the opposite wall of her office, a framed diagram of the human vascular system, which she had taken from a medical supply catalog years ago because the color coding was accurate, and she found accurate color coding satisfying. "Okay," she said. A pause. "That's all? Okay? What else is there to say?" "I don't know. Something. You've been carrying this for 11 years, Nora." "I know." She looked at the diagram. "I'm going to finish the wrongful death review, and then I'm going to call Cass and tell her. Then I'm going to go home." "You should do something to celebrate." "I will." She thought about what that would look like. She thought about her kitchen table, and a bottle of wine she'd been saving for a reason she hadn't fully articulated even to herself, and the particular quality of quiet that comes to a house when the thing you've been waiting for has finally, completely finished waiting. "I'm going to sit in my backyard and not think about anything for a while. That's what I want." "Okay," Patricia said. "That's allowed." She called Cass from the parking structure that evening, walking to her car in the cold. Cass answered on the second ring. "Tell me," Nora told her. "All of it, in the order it happened, beginning with the sanctions and ending with the supplementary note and the referral." Cass listened without interrupting, which was unusual for her. When Nora finished, Cass said, "I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly." "When have I not?" "Fair. Are you okay? Not professionally. Actually, okay." Nora thought about it. She reached her car and stood next to it without getting in, looking at the concrete column in front of her, which had a crack running from floor to ceiling that someone had patched badly several years ago. "I feel strange," she said. "Not bad, just strange. Like I've been walking with something heavy for so long that now that I'm not carrying it, I don't quite know what my gait looks like." Cass laughed softly. "That's the most forensic pathologist way I've ever heard anyone describe relief." "Is that what it is?" "Yeah, that's what it is." Nora got in the car. She sat for a moment before starting the engine. Through the parking structure's open side, she could see the edge of the campus, the tops of the oak trees that lined the central walk, the building where the hearing had taken place. She thought about Harold Bassett in the corridor, holding his briefcase with both hands, deciding to do what he should have done 11 years earlier. She thought about Patricia Mohn flagging the anomaly in Table 4 without knowing what it would set in motion. Gabriel Torres reaching for his baseline numbers and finding something that didn't fit. She thought about Cass calling her at 11 o'clock at night with that particular tone in her voice, None of them had known what she was carrying, but every one of them had, at a specific moment, decided that what they were looking at mattered enough to say something about it. And those decisions, stacked one on top of another over 11 years, without any of them knowing the stack was being built, had produced this afternoon. "The truth doesn't defend itself," she had said in that hearing room. "Someone has to carry it. But you don't always have to carry it alone." She started the car. 3 weeks after the findings were issued, the Journal of Forensic Science published a notice announcing the retraction of the Callaway study. It ran 12 lines. The final line read, "The journal has also determined that attribution practices in the original publication did not accurately reflect the contributions of all research personnel involved. A correction to the methodological credits will be issued in the following issue." Nora read it at her kitchen table on a Saturday morning. The correction issue came out 4 weeks later. It contained a single paragraph, brief, academic in its dryness, almost bureaucratic in its precision, that attributed the analytical framework used in the Callaway study to N. Vasquez, Primary Methodology Design, 2004 to 2005. 11 years, reduced to a parenthetical. She thought about that for a moment. Then she thought about what the parenthetical actually meant. Not as recognition, not as vindication, but as a fixture in the permanent record. The thing that would be there when someone went back to check. The thing that said, "This existed. This person did this work. The work was real." It was enough. Cass came up from Columbus that weekend. They sat on Nora's back porch in the November cold with blankets and 2 cups of coffee, not talking about the case, talking about other things. A mutual friend who had just taken a job in Seattle, a film they had both seen and disagreed about. The squirrel who kept dismantling the bird feeder at the edge of Nora's yard with what Nora described as troubling methodological consistency. At some point, Cass said, "Do you think Hale understood, going into that hearing, what he was walking into?" Nora thought about the expression on his face when Bissett had walked in. "No," she said. "I think he walked in believing the same thing he'd believed for 30 years, that the room would rearrange itself." "What changed his mind?" "The document," Nora said. "Bissett kept his copy. That was all it took. One person who kept his copy." She looked at the yard. The squirrel had reappeared at the bird feeder and was engaged in what appeared to be a systematic structural assessment of the mounting bracket. That's the thing about evidence. It doesn't require anyone to believe in it. It just requires someone to keep it. Cass was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Have you thought about what you want to do next? Career-wise, I mean. Now that the weight is down." Nora had thought about it. She had been thinking about it since the morning after the hearing, when she had woken up and experienced, for the first time in a long time, the particular sensation of a morning that didn't begin with the question of when and how and whether. "Patricia Mohn's office is apparently getting a significant budget increase," she said. "The university's reviewing its research integrity infrastructure. She called me last week, very carefully, very properly, to ask whether I might be interested in consulting on methodology review cases, not full-time, but as a resource. Are you?" Nora looked at the squirrel, who had successfully detached the mounting bracket and was sitting on the ground regarding it, with what she chose to interpret as satisfaction. "I think I might be," she said. "I'm good at looking at data and finding what doesn't fit. I've always been good at that." She paused. "I spent 11 years doing it on one case. Might be more useful to apply it to others." Cass smiled. "Nora Vasquez, Research Integrity Consultant. Let's not put it on a business card yet." "Why not?" "Because I'm still watching the squirrel figure out the bird feeder, and I want to see how it ends." Cass laughed. The November light came through the trees at a low angle that made the yard look like a photograph of itself. And Nora sat in it, with her coffee going slowly cold in her hands, in the particular quiet of a person who has put down something heavy and is only now beginning to discover what her hands feel like empty. 6 months later, on a Tuesday afternoon in spring, Nora was reviewing documentation for a research integrity case. A different case, a different institution, a junior faculty member who had flagged what appeared to be selective outcome reporting in a clinical trial, when her office door opened and Patricia Mohn looked in. "Dr. Bassett called," Patricia said. "He wanted me to pass something along." She held out a folded note. Nora took it. Inside was a single line in an old man's careful handwriting. "I kept better records after 2004. Old habits, eventually, teach themselves." Below it, a second line. "Thank you for showing me what keeping records is for." Nora held the note for a moment. Then she folded it and put it in her desk drawer. Not in the lockbox, not in the manila envelope that now lived in an archival folder she no longer needed to open every morning, but in the ordinary drawer where she kept things that mattered without needing to be weaponized. She went back to work. Outside the window of the county medical examiner's office, the city of Millhaven was doing what cities do in spring. Improbably, stubbornly, with the usual mixture of beauty and noise and indifference to what any individual inside it was carrying. A siren somewhere. A group of students on the path across the street. 2 pigeons disputing a piece of something on the sidewalk with the focused energy of a team that believes outcomes are negotiable. Nora watched them for a moment. Then she turned back to her documents and the careful, methodical, unhurried work of following evidence to wherever it leads. What stays with me is the bird feeder. Or rather, the moment Nora realizes the squirrel got what it came for, and she's actually pleased about it. That's the version of this character I find most interesting. Not the one in the hearing room, precise and unreadable, but the one who sits on her porch in November and respects the squirrel's methodology. Someone who has spent 11 years in an utterly isolated, disciplined patience, and came out the other side still capable of finding something small, genuinely funny. The question I keep turning over: at what point, exactly, did she decide to keep that USB drive? Was it a decision at all, or just the act of someone who keeps everything, and only understood what she was doing years later? If this one landed for you, I'd genuinely like to hear what you made of Harold Bassett. His decision to show up is the hinge the whole thing turns on, and nobody asked him to.